Welcome, friends. Thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Larissa Gil Sanhuesa, and I'm the Young Adult Program Manager at FCNL. Today, we are gathering for our October Quaker Changemaker event titled Grounded in Community, Organizing for Environmental Justice. Now, before we get into it, I want to ask my colleague Emma to share some tech and logistical info.
Thanks, Larissa. Hi, friends. My name is Emma Hulbert, and I serve as the Program Assistant for Quaker Outreach at FCNL. I'm running technology for this event, so I just want to tell you a few tech considerations before we get started. First, as some of you are already doing, please go ahead and say hello in the chat. You can do your name, location, where you're tuning in from, meeting church, if any. Thank you all so much for being here. We're really excited. As you can see, we are recording this evening's speaker portions, but the audience will not be included in the recording for privacy reasons. Even so, feel free to turn off your video if you are uncomfortable keeping it on. Captioning is available automatically, as you can see. If you do not want to see these captions, you can click on the live transcript option on your Zoom toolbar and then click Hide Subtitles. We will have some time for you to ask questions towards the end of the event. We'll do our best to address as many questions as we have time for, but we will likely not be able to get to all of them. So throughout this event, as questions come to you, please go ahead and submit them in the chat, and then we will pass them on to our moderator. If you have any questions about Zoom tech support or just anything at all throughout this event, feel free to private message me in the Zoom chat bar, or you can email me at ehulbert@fcnl.org. All right, that's it for the tech considerations. Back to you, Larissa.
Thank you, Emma. Now, as we get started, I'd like to ask all of you friends to please join me for a few moments of grounding silence. And I will break that silence to get us started with some conversation. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, friends. And thank you for being here again. It is so great to see all of you come out to have this conversation about environmental justice together on this call. I hope that we can live out that Quaker commitment to justice and environmental protection by learning about and eventually advocating together on this issue. We know that the climate crisis is getting worse and rapidly. But what we don't talk about often enough is that marginalized communities disproportionately experience the negative impacts of climate change and our climate policy. Environmental justice seeks to give power back to these communities so they can protect themselves against this impact and find solutions to the damage our climate policies have already caused. It is an issue of equity. Black, Brown, Indigenous, and low-income communities should no longer be burdened with the legacy of pollution and environmental harm. We're excited to dive deeper into this today and learn about our work around the Environmental Justice for All Act. Now, this bill is not only a priority for FCNL's environmental lobbyists, but also FCNL's class of young adult community organizers, the Advocacy Corps. This bill prioritizes environmental justice at the national policy level in a way that we have not seen before. And it gives power back to directly impacted communities as they navigate the climate crisis. So I'm excited to dive into this conversation to learn with you all how FCNL, friends, and like-minded advocates around the country are working together in solidarity with frontline communities to seek an earth restored. Now, joining me for this conversation are two of those community organizers I mentioned from the Advocacy Corps program and our lead lobbyist on climate issues. So first we have Madison Sings. Madison is an Advocacy Corps organizer and a senior at Warren Wilson College in Asheville, North Carolina. She is double majoring in environmental policy and justice and public policy. Last year, she helped organize a dialogue with community members regarding racial equality, and she also spearheaded an initiative that resulted in Warren Wilson College President Lynn Morton becoming the first college president in North Carolina to sign the Higher Education Carbon Pricing Endorsement Initiative. Thank you for that, Madison, and thank you for all the other work you're doing. We also have Paige Schroeder, who is also an Advocacy Corps organizer and senior at the University of South Dakota. She is a double major in political science and philosophy with a specialization in ethics, law, and society. Additionally, she minors in nonprofit studies. As an undergraduate, Paige has engaged with public policy, civic engagement, and research. In the future, she hopes to work as a lobbyist advocating for progressive policy. So clearly on the right track here. And finally, we have Clarence Edwards. He leads FCNL's work on sustainable energy and environmental policy, working closely with me and the Advocacy Corps this year. He brings to FCNL extensive experience in government relations, issue advocacy, and strategic communications. Clarence has represented the policy interests of governments, non-governmental organizations, and foundations. Clearly, we have three amazing experts to join us today and to share their stories and their expertise. But before we begin, I do want to remind everyone that in a public forum like this, we are asking our speakers to be vulnerable with a lot of people. I just said, sharing a lot of stories and expertise. I am grateful, and I know the rest of the team is very grateful for Madison, Paige, and Clarence as they are sharing these things with us so that we may be part of an important conversation about Quaker advocacy and organizing for an earth restored. So to honor their lived experiences and willingness to share their knowledge, I, as the moderator, and you all as the audience, have a responsibility to be mindful of the questions we ask and expectations we have of the panelists. I hope we can work together to create a space of learning here tonight and carry this reminder in our hearts and in our spirits. Okay, so let's begin. Let's ask some questions. So to all of our panelists, Paige, Madison, and Clarence, I want to start with, what does environmental justice mean to you?
Well, maybe I'll go ahead and answer that from my perspective. And first of all, thank you everyone who's joining us on this call this evening, this late afternoon, early evening. It's really good to see this turnout. What does environmental justice mean to me? Well, I'll give you the definition that is broadly accepted, broadly agreed to, and then I'll tell you what it means to me. Environmental justice is, and the Environmental Justice for All Act, it's really an idea that's rooted in the principle that all people have a right to pure air, clean water, and an environment that enriches their life and their livelihoods. It is based on the belief that legislation that we're talking about tonight is based on the belief that federal policy can and should seek to achieve justice, health equity, and climate justice for underserved communities. So that's a textbook definition. But what it means to me, in my own words, would be that that no community, no group of people should be overburdened with the legacy of pollution, waste, landfills on their communities. And that everyone does have a right to a healthy environment and a lifestyle where they can flourish and grow. So that's what environmental justice means to me.
And I think, Larissa, if you would have asked me that question, what environmental justice means to me 3 or 4 years ago, I would have the simple answer of just having access to clean air and clean water. But since then, my definition of environmental justice has definitely broadened and expanded in many different ways to include many more different aspects, right? There's Indigenous rights, land back, giving the land back to the people who were here before us. Immigration rights, when we think of natural disasters that are happening all around the world, people are forced to migrate out of their homes because of it. And so that's immigration rights. We see climate change as a global issue now. Healthcare. I went to West Virginia 2 summers ago, and I got to see mountaintop removal firsthand. And when the process of mountaintop removal, they blow up the mountains, quite literally, there's dust particles that are getting into the local community and they're causing respiratory issues. So it's healthcare issue. So environmental justice is not, it can't just be limited to just clean air and water, but it's a basic human rights issue, a human right for everyone to have the land restored to what it was before we came and exploited it, and the right to breathe the air without having to worry about the particles in it, and the right to clean water. And it's just basically an earth restored. So there are many different intersections, in my opinion, of environmental justice. So it's hard to stand firm on one conclusion of it, but I think for the gist of it, basic human rights.
And for me, environmental justice means achieving a restored earth, as you talked about kind of in our introduction today. And for me, a restored earth is a place where every person has access to that clean water, air, and a stable environment. It's when people are free of toxic and hazardous waste materials and trash from their communities and their environment. Not just that, but I think there's an element of community within environmental justice that I think is super important and I want to talk about today. Environmental justice can't be achieved by one person alone. It requires a community. It is obviously important as individuals that we act with justice, and but community is what's gonna make this happen. So, and then of course, we cannot have environmental justice without acknowledging the disparate impacts on communities of color, Indigenous peoples, and low-income neighborhoods. So.
Yeah, I appreciate what you just said, Paige, that there is a sense of individual responsibility for how we engage with the earth, with each other, but we're also talking structural changes, policy changes that need to happen with all of us coming together and finding a solution and uplifting solutions that already exist within communities that are disproportionately impacted, right? And actually listening to those communities. I love how we all said clean air, clean water, and then expanded from that. And something I've been saying since we did this, since we started doing this work with this program specifically, is just how much environmental justice challenges all the notions we have of what it means to work on climate policy, right? Just how expansive these issues are and just how much environmental justice touches issues of equity across a lot of other aspects of our lives and of government work, et cetera. So shifting gears a bit to the values that take us through this work, that lead us to do this work. I mean, we're already kind of touching on that. We've said equity, we've said community. I'm wondering, what does it mean for each of you to be working on environmental justice with a Quaker organization? How do Quakerism and related values show up for you in this work?
I'll go again. I'll just start again. So from my perspective, I was asked something similar to this by a friend of mine a couple of weeks ago, and I'm grateful that he asked the question because it helps me tonight. But the way I look at it, the Quaker community, since the founding of Quakerism, there are two things that really animate the Quaker community in my mind. And just by way of background, I spent from 6th grade to 12th grade at Baltimore Friends School. And so I have an understanding of Quakerism from that experience. I said to my friend that Quakers and the Quaker community has had a long-standing interest and emphasis on social justice, stemming through the religion's history. The Quakers were there when the abolitionist movement started in the UK and also in the US. So an interest and an emphasis on social justice is something that is very important to the Quaker community. That twins with a care for creation and the world that we seek. And so to me, the Quaker community has, for it throughout its history, been well placed to address and think about and advocate for issues that relate to environmental justice, because you have those twin pillars there, a care for God's creation and a care for social justice. Those two things merge in environmental justice and climate justice in my mind.
Yeah, for me, there's 3 beliefs that I hold near to my heart, even though I'm not a Quaker. But the first one is the Quaker belief that every person can be their best self and everybody can reach their full potential. The second one is that there is God in everyone, or of God in everybody. And then the third one is that community has power. And I think that these Quaker values really match up with the work that the Advocacy Corps does when it comes to environmental justice and political advocacy. There's a couple ways I think that the Advocacy Corps kind of exemplifies these values. First, it shows us how to honor each individual as we lobby, even if we disagree with them. 2, it honors the communities that are already on the forefront of climate injustice, including communities of color and Indigenous peoples. And then it's teaching us how to build a community of advocates and then help them be successful and reach their best self. So that's kind of how I see Quaker values in the Advocacy Corps work that I do.
And similar to what you just said, Paige, I also think that when I think about Quaker values and the advocacy work that I do, going into these lobby visits, I have to have on that mindset of seeing the inner God within everyone. And one of the Quaker values is environmental stewardship, which is something I definitely explored before joining the Advocacy Corps, but I've definitely expanded on since being here. Looking back at Genesis and the creation story, God gave dominion over the land to humans. So we are trusted to take care of the land and not to harm it, but we have fallen short over the past few years or past centuries with that. So I think that, reclaiming the land and stopping its exploitation is key, and being stewards, really, when we think about it, we cannot be separate. When we have the mindset that humans are separate from the environment, that's where we fall short. We have to see ourselves as one and united with the environment and truly care for it. And I think it's when we think about like having God's gift of the earth given to us, it's important because one, we're destroying God's precious gift. This is our home. And then also we're not allowing future generations to also enjoy the earth's beauty. So I think environmental stewardship is very key for the work that I do when I talk to my representatives.
I love that we ended that question with that word of stewardship, Madison, because that's what was going through my head, right? And I remember in a previous response, you were talking about Native rights and giving land back, right? Thinking about how stewardship of the earth was and is to take care of the earth. But right now, there seems to be, for me, when I think about this, kind of a non-reciprocal relationship with the earth. We're taking, and we're not taking care. So that stewardship, that value of stewardship that I hold dear to my heart as a Quaker value, I'm really glad was mentioned here at the end. So I hope this is giving people some things to reflect on as we're discussing. And now I want to talk more about the policy itself. So we are, oh, wow, look at that. Someone in the chat just asked about the policy. Right as I said, we're going to move on to that. So perfect timing. It's what the people want. Let's talk a little bit about what opportunity we have in front of us right now. So what is exciting? What is exciting about the Environmental Justice for All Act and other environmental justice initiatives that are before Congress right now? And like I already said, what is the opportunity with this bill at this moment in time?
I'm going to let one of, well, it's policy. I don't want to keep jumping up first, so I defer to Madison or Paige if they would like to start.
Awesome. Yeah. Do one of you want to go first with this question?
I can go ahead and say my piece about it.
Thanks, Madison.
Yeah, of course. So what I really love about the Environmental Justice for All Act is that it's one of the provisions, it strengthens the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and it allows persons to sue for intentional discrimination. And as we all know, like Black, Brown, Indigenous, and low-income communities bear a very disproportionate amount of the impact of environmental injustices. So it has like this idea of standing, right? And it's hard for when there is discrimination happening. Like whenever a group of people want to bring up to court to standing about like having a company that is like a dirty industry that is polluting their land, it's hard for them to gain that standing in the status quo. But with this bill, the burden of proof is now on the dirty industries to prove that they are not intentionally discriminating against the people living there by putting these manufacturing facilities in these marginalized communities. And so I love that this bill is well crafted, giving the power back to the people, so that way we are able to have, you know, the power to go against these companies and these industries that are polluting the land disproportionately at that.
I can go next and kind of talk about what I like about the bill. Exactly what Madison said. I think you put it super eloquently about the legal implications of the bill. Another aspect of the bill that's important to me is the research implications. One of the provisions says that it's going to direct federal agencies to document environmental and human health risks borne by populations identified by race, national origin, or income. This is super important because right now our data set is incomplete, and so our research isn't perfect. And in order to make accurate and good policy, we need that research element. That's me as an individual. I love that aspect of the bill. For South Dakota specifically, where I'm from, I think the grant authorization program has a lot of potential, and I know that there's a lot of people in South Dakota working on environmental justice that would benefit from that.
Have to take myself off mute there would probably help. Something that's really interesting about the bill to me is the fact that, you know, we think about environmental justice as we've been discussing here so far tonight. It's focused on legacy pollution and redress of some of these historic grievances, but it's also forward-looking in terms of supporting more equitable access to the outdoors, something that people don't often think of, but you know, a lot of communities don't have the access to parks and recreational opportunities. And so there is a focus on that for underserved urban communities. My colleague and friend mentioned the environmental justice grants. There's $75 million that's authorized for research and education into environmental and public health issues in communities. There's funding. Funding around economic transition development aid assistance fund to use revenues from oil, gas, and mining to help communities make what we talk about as a just transition to a sustainable low carbon economy. And finally, there's, and probably should have started with this, there's something around cumulative impacts and decisions made under the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and ensuring that permits will not be issued if a proposed project cannot demonstrate a reasonable certainty of no harm to human health. So I'm particularly excited about those aspects. Also, I'll add, one of the interesting things about it is that included in the Environmental Justice for All Act was the establishment of something that the Biden administration has gone ahead and already done. The White House Council on Environmental Justice, known by the unfortunate acronym of WEJAC, but that council is already set up. They've done a lot of work already, leading to the Justice 40 initiative that the administration announced a few months ago, that really has federal agencies focusing on what their role in pursuing and addressing environmental justice needs to be, and having those key federal agencies writing a strategy around how they see their role in advancing environmental justice. So one of the most interesting things about it to me is the fact that we're already seeing some of the ideas from the Environmental Justice for All Act being implemented by the Biden administration. And so that's really exciting to me.
Thank you all. And I'll also add that because we are currently organizing around this bill, we're lobbying on this bill, we also have a sense of how the legislative offices that we're lobbying are reacting to this bill. And that for me is the exciting thing, is that I said earlier during our session here that this puts environmental justice in our national policy agenda in a way that we just haven't seen before. And when we have organizers like Madison and like Paige going into these offices virtually to ask them to support this bill, it's fascinating just how many offices will be reading this bill for the first time because we have asked them to take a look at it and to support it. So that to me is a huge opportunity. We are really putting this on the map for a lot of legislative offices because someone has to do that. And I am very proud to be working on this with organizers like Madison and Paige and with Clarence to get that on the agenda, to put it at the forefront of our legislators' minds. We are right now in the stage of building support. We want more co-sponsors. We want more people talking about this bill. We want more people talking about the issue. So to kind of end with a concrete example of what environmental justice might look like in our communities, and then we'll open up for some questions from the audience. I want to ask each of you, what does environmental injustice look like in local communities? What are some examples just to really help us pin down what we're talking about here? And how would the bill, the Environmental Justice for All Act, address those local cases?
I want to share a couple of examples with you. Number one, I was talking to my father about environmental justice, telling him what I was working on with FCNL, one of the issues I'm working on with FCNL. And I told him about the EJ for All Act and so forth. And he stopped and he said to me, he grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Rocky Mount, North Carolina back in the 20s and 30s. He's 88 years old now. And he said to me, they opened a landfill 5 blocks away from our house when I was growing up in a middle-class neighborhood in Rocky Mount. And I mentioned it was middle-class because it's almost not really bounded by class. And sometimes it's not bounded by race. But that really brought it home to me that you can, even if you are part of America's middle class, that it seemed to be okay for people to do that. So this issue, which really got national prominence in the 80s in North Carolina, in the county next to where my father lives, has been with us for a very long time. So that's one thing. That brought it home to me. What does it look like? It looks like if you Google Cancer Alley in Louisiana, St. James Parish, where you have rows of petrochemical facilities, and people lived in that community before those facilities existed. But sometimes you'll hear people say, well, people should just move out of these communities. Why should they be living next to a petrochemical facility? Their community was there before the facility. So that's what it looks like to me. It looks like the Wheelabrator plant recycling facility in southern Baltimore, the town that I grew up in, where you have this recycling facility that's spewing out SOx, nitrous oxide, and PM 2.5. So that's what it really looks like. And these facilities are literally right next door to people's homes. So I've learned more about environmental justice in the process of doing this job over the past year. And I'll just say that once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Absolutely. And speaking of North Carolina, I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I didn't find out until probably about a few years ago that there's actually a toxic waste site that is very close to my home. It's about five miles. I can ride my bike to the waste site, which is scary to think about because the home that I grew up in, it's so close to proximity to this nasty pollutant site that could potentially be getting into the water and into the air. So it's very scary just for me to think about, and my family still lives there too, which it's even more frightening for me. Then I come to Warren Wilson College. I'm in Asheville, North Carolina, and I love this. I love the views that I have all the time, the pretty land, pretty nature, right? Then to come to find out that there's a Chemtronic site down the road that's actually, I could walk across the street and it takes me 3 minutes to get to a Superfund site where they used to manufacture explosive propellants and incapacitating agents and a variety of chemicals that have infiltrated the ground and our soil. And so it's just like, I cannot escape. That's how my mindset was when I found out about this. It's like, it's inescapable. I can't escape it. But one thing I love about the Environmental Justice for All Act is that I can reclaim that power. I can feel like I can do something about these atrocities happening, because they are happening to my communities that I love so much, right? And so we see with this bill giving that power back to the people and also funding for state and organizations to help do something about what's happening. So I think I find a lot of my hope and my power from the bill.
Yeah, for me, in South Dakota, concentrated animal feeding operations are a pretty big deal. In short, they're called CAFOs. CAFOs are known to be air and water polluters, and they're currently being built on and off reservations, with the majority being on the east side of the state. I was an intern in the 2020 South Dakota legislative session, and I was there when they passed a bill that did make it easier for these CAFOs to come into communities by lowering the voting threshold, and then made it harder to kick them out by raising the voting threshold. So I think a provision of the Environmental Justice for All Act that could help with this specific problem is strengthening the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and then again amending the Clean Air Act to require cumulative impact to be considered in permits. And so basically this year in 2021, there was another bill that got passed that doubled the length of time a permit is valid for CAFOs, which again, that specific provision is super important and could potentially change the tide in South Dakota against these polluters.
I just want to build on really quickly what Paige said, because CAFOs and Madison will know about this too down in North Carolina. It's something else my father said to me. He said, those feedlots, those areas, or the processing plants. It's just it's one of the most disgusting, one of the most ancient and brutal sort of operations, and that waste just sits there. And that's a huge issue in North Carolina as well. The other point I wanted to make is that this isn't just about communities, say here in North Carolina or on the East Coast, because
Clarence, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but I think we lost you. Okay, well, when he comes back on, we can have him finish his thought. But what I wanted to kind of bring us back to is some of these examples were clear to people. You know, they were seeing them already. They had some idea that there was this issue. But for all of us, when we started doing this work, our first step basically was to do this research, because sometimes it isn't obvious, or sometimes you don't realize that what's happening in your area is an example of environmental injustice. So there are many resources out there that you can use to look up what Superfund sites might be in your area, what other hazardous waste facilities might be in your area, or what policies might be damaging your area in terms of environmental climate policy, right? So that often becomes, or that often is the first step in really grounding yourself in this work. But I see that Clarence is back. Do you want to finish, Clarence?
Sorry about that. The technology.
No worries.
You can hear me okay? No,
yes,
I was just making
perfect.
the point. I was just making the point that, I don't know where you lost me, but I was just making the point that Native American communities also deal with environmental justice challenges from uranium mining, particularly in the desert Southwest. And so our Native American brothers and sisters are also impacted by the lack of environmental justice that we see in this country.
Thank you, Clarence. I'm glad that you lifted that up. It's very important. Glad you were able to finish your thought. All right, so let's open up to some audience questions. And thankfully, we have an amazing team that's already been sending me what these questions are, in addition to having them in the chat. So we should definitely be getting to your question, and apologies if we miss it. But the first one I'm gonna direct to Madison and Paige, and then we can move over to Clarence. I'm curious question is from Dan. What seems to be the main opposition to this bill? Madison and Paige, what are you hearing when you have lobbied these offices? What is the opposition to this bill?
The main opposition I hear in South Dakota is mostly in regards to industry. My senators and representative are afraid of the impacts that this bill could have on industry. They mentioned the implications on taxpayers. From what I know, my senators and representative are not a fan of amending the Clean Air Act or amending and strengthening the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So that's the main opposition in South Dakota.
For my region in North Carolina, I have all Republican senators and representatives. So I get a lot of different feedback. Some say that they don't want big government. This bill they think will expand the government, which is not entirely true. And then also one of my senators said maybe we should, or his staffer said, start local, start with on the state level before we try to move it to a federal level. So that's one pushback that we got, but also to a rebuttal for that would be the first provision allows for funding for the states and local governments to be able to do this work in the first place. So how about we pass the bill for them to do the environmental justice work that needs to be done. And then also one of my representatives said my representative said we need to protect the coal and gas industry. So that was a pushback that I got. And they also said that the oil and gas companies will be around forever, so we need to protect them, which is also false.
Clarence, what do you think? Is this what we're hearing across the board?
It's interesting because, sorry, I was messing around with my video audio, but one of the challenges I found is that on the Hill, there's still a lot of education that needs to be done with congressional staff on both sides of the aisle about environmental justice. People know about it, but they don't know really the details. So there's a learning process that needs to go on. I think people are much more up to speed on it now. I think that some offices have a different perspective on what environmental justice is and how to address it. But I think the biggest challenge and the biggest pushback comes from people who really haven't engaged with the issue a lot in the past. But I see that as a challenge that we can overcome.
Yeah, like I was saying earlier, we're doing a lot of educating right now, right, Clarence, of legislative offices. And besides what Madison and Paige are saying, I've heard from other organizers that pushback is really coming from just not understanding what the bill does. And
Right.
It's just more about asking a lot of questions because they hadn't heard about it yet, or they didn't know, or they don't know generally what environmental justice means. So we are definitely serving as educators in our advocacy role right now with this bill.
No, absolutely.
Another question I have here is from William. Could the panelists address the international aspect of climate and environmental justice? Historically, the US has produced more greenhouse gases than any other country. So far, most of the severe damages of climate change are falling most heavily on people who have done very little to contribute to climate change. How should we be redressing that injustice? And I'm going to throw that over to Clarence. Madison, Paige, I don't know if you have any thoughts, but I know we generally focus on our domestic policy within the program. So I'll throw this question over to Clarence.
Sure. And, it's interesting because I would say that I'll say two things. The way that environmental justice has played out and the legacy and the dynamics here in the US are very different than what's happening overseas. And so I wouldn't necessarily term the global dimension is different. So yeah, the US has, in Western democracies, Western countries are responsible for a lot of the legacy emissions. And the challenge today is that, as China and India and other developing countries start to develop and build their societies and economies, more emissions are coming from there. But the historic legacy of the carbon that is in the atmosphere right now, the majority of that was put there by the United States, Europe, and other countries. And so there is this is the challenge now. How do you address that historic imbalance in emissions? How do you make it fair for developing countries that are still trying to reach a level of societal development that we've reached here in the West, in countries that are still struggling in a lot of cases with regular access to electricity? There are still countries in parts of sub-Saharan Africa where the electricity is going for maybe only 6 or 7 hours a day. How do you, and this is one of the issues that will come up at the COP summit in Glasgow in a few days or so. How do you make it fair? How do you impart justice for those countries that are still developing and that have, in some cases, been the victim of the practices of oil, gas, and mining companies from the U.S. and from other Western countries? So I just want to raise that because what we're talking about and what we're thinking about in terms of environmental justice is very different when you look at climate justice globally on the international stage. You have issues around indigenous groups in the Amazon, for example, and their rights. That's a climate justice issue. You have the issue of Pacific Island nations that are suffering from the consequences of sea level rise, and that have, as a government minister from a Pacific Island nation said to me back in 2015, He said, this is an existential crisis for countries in the Pacific, for those small island countries in the Pacific. You have challenges around exposure to dangerous levels of heat and heat waves in countries in South Asia or so. So there are climate justice and environmental justice issues on a global scale, and they're very different from the challenges in a lot of ways. They're very different from the challenges that we're facing here, but they do exist.
Thank you, Clarence. All right, now we have another question. This one's from Ian. We talked earlier about other environmental justice initiatives beyond the Environmental Justice for All Act, right? Clarence, you mentioned just what commitment has been made by Joe Biden's administration, for example. So Ian wants to know if there are any aspects of environmental justice that will make it into the Build Back Better legislation, and how we can be working to make sure that those provisions of environmental justice do end up in that very large Build Back Better plan that we know is really trying to hold a lot of changes.
Well, I know that there are a lot of provisions around safe drinking water. Lead pipe removal is a good example, either in the Build Back Better Act or in the infrastructure and what used to be known as the bipartisan infrastructure framework. It's now the Infrastructure Jobs Act. Money for lead pipe replacement is very important. Money, there's $1 billion in the infrastructure bill to start the removal of highways that were built in the 50s and 60s through the neighborhoods of people of color and of ethnic minorities. That happened in cities like Baltimore or New York. It happened across the country. And so there are discrete provisions within legislation that the Congress is working on to address those really fundamental issues and challenges. Another aspect that I'll raise is that in the infrastructure bill, there is the most money, and I don't have it off the top of my head, but it's the most money that the federal government has ever spent on mass transit and clean transportation that is particularly beneficial to people who can't work remotely, have to get up and go to work every day, but they're exposed to, the fumes from buses and highways and so forth. So the federal government is going to make a really big investment in public transit for cities. And that's an environmental justice issue as well, because that really impacts the quality of life for a lot of people in the country. So where the EJ for All Act stands right now is that it's not really included in the conversations that are going on, but there are other aspects of environmental justice as an issue that we hope, and we're going to be working on lobbying on that in the next couple of weeks, will make it into the final package. One last thing that I'll raise about this, there is also a tax credit for low-income homeowners to access funding so that they can put solar in their homes. And it's called 25D. That's the designation in the tax code. But that would really open up opportunities for people to take advantage of renewable energy so that they can have it for their homes. And that's something that I see as very important. Giving people access to this low carbon economy and the opportunities in that economy is really crucial.
Thank you, Clarence. And thank you to the audience for all of those questions. I hope that everyone got the deep dive that they were looking for into this issue, into how we can be advocating on this issue. I do like to end these conversations on a positive note. So I have one last question for our panelists. I like to say, and in the work that I'm doing specifically with Madison and Paige, as constituents, we play a unique role in the policymaking process, one that we're embracing through this program, through our advocacy. We make sure that legislators are prioritizing the policies that we care about, right? But because we care so much about these different issues, and we might even be impacted by these issues, it's easy to feel very tired in this work. It's easy to feel that the work is slow. I don't think anyone here is going to say that Congress works quickly, right? So, Paige and Madison, as you're beginning this work of organizing your communities for environmental justice, what is a story or an interaction that has given you hope in continuing to do this? And what would you say to folks who might be feeling discouraged about engaging in direct advocacy through lobbying Congress on this issue?
I can go first. And one of the best parts about being a part of the Advocacy Corps truly is learning how to build that community. And so my positive interactions are all about that. So I've met 2 adults in particular who are super positive. So Barbara Cromwell recently contacted Bobby Trice actually through FCNL, and she is a Quaker from Rapid City, South Dakota, and wants to reach out and talk to me. So that's super positive. I love making connections with new people, and honestly, it's a small world. So that was super fun. And then the other person I've met is Mark Winiger, who is the chair of the South Dakota Sierra Club. We've had a lot of good connections, and he's introduced me to adults who are for environmental justice. I am on a college campus, so I interact with a lot of like 18 to 22-year-olds, but it is fun and inspiring to work with people who have been on the forefront of environmental justice for decades. So yeah, those are my interactions that give me a lot of hope. As for what I would say to somebody who's feeling discouraged, I say this a lot on my campus to people I'm trying to organize with, is that you do not need to be an expert. You do not need to be affiliated with politics to lobby or show concern for a bill. This is just the top concern I get. And basically, I think there's 2 things you actually need in order to lobby, and it's passion and hope. So you need passion to get you to the visit. Okay, you need passion to engage with environmental justice and to want to lobby. And then you need hope to get you through the visit. So I'm working with more conservative offices when it comes to environmental justice. And so hope is just a requirement for this kind of work. And so I always say you don't need to be an expert, but you do need to have passion and hope. But that's all.
Yeah, I also wholeheartedly agree with you, Paige. I think one, being a part of the Advocacy Corps and also meeting individuals that are also passionate about environmental justice really helps motivate me to keep going. But also on like here in Asheville, I work at a martial arts studio. And so I just think about the kids and the future. And I think about the planet that they will have to go through and to deal with. And it kind of, I think that's what is the main driving motivation for me. And also my nieces and my nephew, they're all under the age of 5. So they haven't even experienced much of life yet. And I want them to have a livable planet, the same one that me and you are able to live on right now. So I think my advice for anyone that is, going through the same process and looking for hope, I think that what I find is that finding that someone you want to make a difference for in this world. For me, those are the little kids that I teach in Taekwondo class and my nieces and nephew. So those are who I want to fight for this planet. So that way they have a future and they can live on for generations and generations.
I'll agree with Paige and Madison, and I take a lot of strength from working with young people like these 2 great examples of current and future advocates, that gives me a lot of motivation to know that they will keep the momentum and keep working for change, and that we're helping them to do that. That's motivating for me.
Thanks, everyone. I hope everyone is feeling full from this conversation. I hope people are ready to advocate with us on this issue or advocate on your own on this issue. I'm going to hand it off to Emma in just a moment to close us out. But I just really want to thank you all for taking the time to sit with us today, share some community with us today. And I hope you're able to ground yourself in these values of equity and justice and stewardship, right? That lead us to caring about issues like the Environmental Justice for All Act. So thanks, everybody, and I'll hand it off to you, Emma.
Thanks, Larissa. And yeah, just quickly before we jump off tonight and conclude our time together, I want to make sure all of you are aware of a few things. First, if you are interested in connecting with an Advocacy Corps organizer or FCNL staff person for lobbying support, you can just fill out this form that I'll put in the chat now. And in addition, we would love to see you all at annual meeting in the Quaker Public Policy Institute from November 17th to 21st. It's not too late to register, and I'll put the registration link right there as well. All right, well, thank you all so much for joining with us this evening, and a huge, huge thank you to our panelists, Clarence, Madison, Paige, and our moderator, Larissa. You're all phenomenal. I hope you all have a lovely evening, and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, everybody.